I think we can kick off now.
Thanks, Olivia. Apologies for starting a couple of minutes late, everyone. I think we've had a few problems with people getting in and people are still trickling in. So good morning, everyone, and a warm welcome to our discussion today on how the shift in flexible working is influencing flexible hiring in Scotland. For those of you that don't know me, I'm Panglea and I head up the CIPD in Scotland and Northern Ireland, and I'm delighted to be hosting today's discussion with Timewise co-founder Emma Stewart. So flexible working is a key policy and practice area for us at the CIPD, and we recently launched a new campaign called #FlexFromFirst, which is calling on organisations and the government to make the right to request flexible working a day one right. And I'll be providing a little bit more context on the rationale for this and CIPD's work in this area before handing over to Emma, who will share detail of the Scottish Flexible Working Jobs Index, Scottish Flexible Job Index, I think it's called. And Emma will also explore the implications for HR practitioners, what actions can be taken to ensure that the shifts in ways of working are translated into the changes that we are all looking to achieve. Before I go any further, I'd just like to flag up some practical housekeeping stuff. This is an informal discussion. After I pass over to Emma and Emma finishes, there will be some time for questions at the end of Emma's discussion. So please post any questions into the chat function as they come to your mind throughout the discussion, and we will answer as many of them as possible. The session is being recorded and the slides will be shared afterwards. So without further ado, I'm going to kick off with a little bit more context around CIPD's focus on flexible working and I guess our rationale for the campaign in this area. So it makes sense for the purpose of our discussion today to think about before and during the pandemic. I don't think we can actually say after the pandemic yet, unfortunately, but we know that before the pandemic hit, just under a third of workers were working from home occasionally. So that's those that were doing some work from home in their main job. And with about 5% working from home all the time. The trend towards flexible working practice was steadily increasing, but we hadn't seen any huge increases of late, but Emma will obviously share a little bit more on the trends with you later. But as you can see from the slides, there are clear benefits for both the employer and the employee from each perspective. And while I don't have time on this call to share any specific detail on this today, CIPD has a raft of insight and guidance on this available from our website, as does Timewise, and as do other organisations like Flexibility Works. So lots of insight and guidance on this. But if we move to the next slide, which is looking at flexible working during the pandemic, our data shows, as you would expect, that following the pandemic and the need for social distancing, etc., there's been a huge change in flexible working. COVID, the closing of schools, the stay-at-home message, etc., has meant that people and employers have had flexibility forced upon them. Over half the workforce have typically been working from home, and about a quarter of those working from home all the time. And many people are saying that actually there's been this decade's worth of workplace change that's happened over the past few months, year. And if we take working from home as an indicator of flexibility, although we all know that it's much broader than that, the current debate is skewed towards working from home and giving the impression that flex working is done. That isn't everybody working flexibly nowadays. And it's true, there has been a great opportunity in the past year to make progress. And the pandemic has shone a spotlight on all the opportunities and benefits of flexible working, but we still haven't quite ticked that flexible working box yet. And Emma will share more on that later. For one thing, there's still a substantial segment of the workplace that hasn't been working from home at all, perhaps mostly because the nature of the job doesn't allow them to. And also, working from home has been much more prevalent amongst people in higher paid occupations. So there's this widening flexibility gap emerging. So if we look forward, on to the next slide, so thank you. There's no doubt that home working is set for a sustained increase post-crisis. The new term on everyone's lips is hybrid working. It's a hugely popular topic, which I know Emma's going to pick up on later. And if you didn't join CIPD's webinar on the topic last week, then I would encourage you to look it up on our Coronavirus Hub and listen into it. So while we're expecting that big shift in flexibility of location, we're expecting less focus on other forms of flexible working, which allow flexibility over hours, different working patterns, etc. And if we look specifically at data gathered from employers recently, and if we look at in particular our Scottish sample, half of those employers that took part in our research plan to take steps to enable more home working and hybrid working in the next 6 to 12 months, but less than a third are planning to increase the uptake of other forms of flexible working over that same period. And then if we look at our recent employee surveys, 46% across the UK say that they don't have flexible working arrangements in place, so that's employees. But the figure is actually higher in Scotland and just under a half. So there's lots of questions around fairness, around availability of flexible working from an employee perspective. And I know Emma will pick up on much of that later. So just very quickly, before I introduce Emma, I would really like to talk about our Flex from First campaign. So all the data and insight that I've shared so far, but also that Emma will share later, it forms a key part of the rationale behind CIPD's #FlexFromFirst campaign, which is all about supporting fairness and opening up opportunities more widely. There's of course a significant business case for investing in flexible working. It can boost job satisfaction and commitments, support inclusion and diversity, improve well-being, help organisations to attract and retain talent. We're calling on employers to make the right to request flexible working a day one right. We know from our survey data that many organisations are already doing this, so it's about increasing the uptake of good practice. And there's also a strong case for government to make a change to a day one right, rather than employees having to earn the right after working for an employer for 26 weeks. The last thing about our campaign, which is I'd like to highlight, is we're also championing this work through the Flexible Working Task Force, which was formed under the last government. It was paused during the pandemic, but it's now reconvened. And organisations like FSB, TUC, CIPD, obviously, FSB, CBI, and of course DWP, ACAS, and of course Timewise are involved in this too. And it has a really wide-ranging purpose, but it's all about supporting more inclusive, flexible working and boosting those flexible working conversations in the workplace. So our call to our members and all our supporters is to support the campaign. If you can share across social media and across your networks, and get in touch if you know organisations that are doing this already, because we're really keen to share good practice. And then just finally, I'd like to flag up some CIPD flexible working resources before I hand over to Emma. So as I said, there's lots of research guidance and practical toolkits available on our website. So take a look at these if you haven't had a chance to. So anyway, less from me, and I'm now going to pass on to Emma to hear more about Timewise's flexible working jobs index and findings in Scotland. It's a bit of a mouthful. Over to you, Emma. Thank you.
Thanks, Lee. It is a bit of a mouthful. Maybe next year we'll make it shorter. Delighted to be here. Thank you all for coming, and thank you for CIPD for all the advocacy and the work you're doing around flexible working. We've been delighted to be partnering with CIPD for a number of years on this agenda, and particularly for the last year, as Timewise, we've been undertaking a programme to see how we can improve fairer, flexible work in Scotland, and CIPD are a strategic partner. Just to kick off, really, the session or the research I wanted to share with you today, it links very much to CIPD's Flexible First campaign. So Lee said many organisations are already considering flexible working from day one. The challenge is how many jobs now do offer flexible working from day one. And the purpose of the research is to look every year at what that ratio of jobs is. I'll explain a bit about why in a sec, and then I'll talk you through the findings of this year's research and what are the implications, and just want to end with some examples of employers in Scotland who are embracing this and some of the learnings they've had. Firstly, by way of introduction, I'm co-founder of Timewise. For those of you who don't know, we are a social business. We have been shouting about flexible working for about 15 years, so the world's changed a lot in that time. We do research, we do thought leadership, and crucially, we go into businesses and help them through our change programs and our consultancy to get better at flexible working. Our clients range from many of the FTSE 500 companies, increasingly global, as well as small businesses who just want to embrace flex for all the reasons Lee said. We also run a job site. Our social mission that drives our work is to ensure everyone gets the flexibility in work without compromising their careers. That isn't the case yet. And so we represent about 100,000 candidates who want their next job to be a good and flexible job. And as I said, we also have recently been working in Scotland on a specific initiative to try and unlock better quality jobs to flex from day one and enable more people to be able to access them. So that's just a bit about us. So first, what is the index? So we run a national index and have done for 6 years, specifically to look at what proportion of job vacancies reference flexible working from day one. And this year, and this report that I'm about to talk you through, is the second time we have done a specific index for Scotland. And what we do is we have a unique tool that is nationally sort of regarded, and it's recognised by industry and policymakers. We scan all job vacancies advertised on jobs boards over a period of time. So this report is looking at 2020, the year of flexible working in theory. And we look at job vacancies that reference flexible working in the job ad. And what we mean by that, and we have a tool to determine it, is they either reference how much people work, so part-time or job share. They reference where people work, so clearly what we've all been doing, working from home or remote working. And they may also reference when people are able to work, as in staggered start and finish times, often less likely. The point is, they are explicitly talking about how to be able to offer that to enable people to have more control from day one in the way they work. And we looked last year at over 375,000 job vacancies in Scotland. Why do we do it? For many of the reasons Lee's touched on, but crucially, we know flexible working matters to people. We know historically employers have predominantly used it as a retention tool, so to keep hold of people who need to work differently and who ask. It's in response to requests, and that request response model is really important because that's historically how we've thought about flexible working. But yet all the evidence tells us that people who need to work flexibly or who want to work flexibly often struggle with job mobility. They struggle to find a job that references flexible working from day one in the jobs market. And that has significant consequences, which we'll come on to talk about. So they need flex hiring. That's a term we use at Timewise. Flex from first. They need the ability to be able to move into a job and from day one to know that they can work flexibly. So we do the index because we knew this was a problem. We knew people were struggling to get jobs from day one that were flexible. We've been tracking the market for 6 years, and the data has been really important to lobby, to influence, increasingly now to think about legislation, but also hopefully for you as HR practitioners to give you some tools and resources to influence internally your organisations to rethink your recruitment practices. So let me talk you through the data. So Olivia, next slide, please. So the first thing to say is the ratio of flexible jobs in Scotland last year, considering we've been through a pandemic-induced flexible working crisis, have shifted, but they've only shifted to 24%. Now, in one sense, that's a good news story. It's higher than the national average. The UK average is around 22%. But also, if you flip that, what it means is still only 3 out of 4 job vacancies in Scotland don't say anything about flexible working at the point of hire. And that is quite something when we think about what happened last year. So in the last 4 years in Scotland, the ratio has gone from 16% to 24%. In the middle of last year, it creeped up. It's now settling back down. There's a lot more we can do about this, which I'll come on to later. So 3 in 4 jobs in Scotland do not reference anything about flexible working at the point of hire. Olivia, next slide, please. I thought I'd touch now on just some of the specific analysis that we've done in the report. The report is available on our website, timewise.co.uk, and obviously these slides and this recording will be available after the session. But let's look firstly at job types. So if you are looking to attract talent, or if people are looking for a job in Scotland, what kind of jobs are advertised as flexible from day one? Obviously recognising there are different types of flexibility. You'll see from this graph that predominantly part-time has historically been the most referenced form of flexible working in job vacancies, as well as a generic statement, we offer flexible working. So if you're a job seeker, you're more likely to find in this pool jobs that say part-time or jobs that say generic flexible working. The shift this year has unsurprisingly been in working from home. So you'll see in the middle of this graph that pre-pandemic levels were very, very low on employers stating that people could work from home from day one. That has risen, but it's only gone from 3 to 7%. So it's still remarkably low, considering the wholesale change we've had this year. Next slide, please. Then we look at salary level. Now, those of you caring about your D&I strategies, thinking about your gender pay gaps, I hope will already know this, but the information we have about job vacancies reflects the information we know about the impact that working part-time and working flexibly has on career progression, and particularly in the context of gender pay gap. What we have seen this year is that there has been a slight rise in better quality jobs offering flexibility from day one. So you'll see in the middle of the graph, the black line shows a slight uplift from around sort of the average sort of 35k jobs up to 60k jobs referencing flexibility. Now, our assumption on that is based on the fact that obviously more office-based jobs and more higher knowledge-based salary jobs are now being worked from home, and therefore that is why we have a slight higher shift. Having said that, it's still far more the lower paid roles that are advertising flex. And we know that part-time is the predominant in terms of flex, but part-time sits in lower paid pay brackets. And that is a major concern for people who need to work less, but it's also obviously a concern for yourselves in thinking about the context of how can you deliver on gender balance, how can you deliver on diversity, and thinking about why part-time would necessarily be paying a lower rate. There is a sectoral element to this, which obviously we'll also be aware of. So salary, higher level, more flex, lower level, more part-time. Next slide, please. And then for those of you in different industries, I hope this will be of interest. We also look at role type. So if you are looking for a job in Scotland, what industry is most likely to offer you flexible or part-time working? Again, this probably won't be a surprise, it mirrors the employment market. If you are looking at health and social services, you are more likely to find flexibility. We know the public sector has often been very good at this, at flexibility. We also know in many roles it's feasible to work more flexibly. The stat I will call, or the industries I will call out here are those frontline industries that are very male dominated. We have engineering, we have manufacturing, and we have construction that are still very, very low in terms of ratio of jobs that can be advertised as flex. I mean, around 1 in 10. And if you are working in those industries, again, I would call out, we have so many initiatives around attracting women into engineering, manufacturing and construction. We need to be thinking about advertising roles as flexible from day one in those industries, because that's often what women really need. Timewise has done a major programme in the construction industry, actually looking at what sits behind this, and there are legitimate, as you will know if you work in these industries, operational barriers to see how we can try and find some flex in frontline shift-based roles. But the point more broadly here is, if you are in these industries, it is feasible to do this. And one of the considerations is how to try and think through the challenges that Lee also called out around not having a two-tier workforce in your response to hybrid, when people start coming back to offices or not, and people in frontline teams are excluded from the conversation about flexibility. Next slide, please. And then finally, I just want to touch on location. Where in Scotland are you most likely to get a flexible job? Argyll and Bute at 35%, which is amazing. I think we should all go and live there. No, but seriously, I think there is a correlation, and we know, and you will know this as employers, between balance of supply and demand. So where you have a dense proportion of people, employers may be less thinking, how do I attract talent? How can I think about different things to do to bring people in? And flexibility may not be on your bucket list. When you are in rural and remote communities and there aren't that many people, but also people have issues around travelling, you are more likely. The one other thing I want to call out here, because generally the averages are roughly the same, is clearly we know in Scotland, Glasgow and Edinburgh have the majority of vacancies in Scotland. So 2 in 5 of all jobs last year were advertised in those 2 cities and regions. Their average is around 25–26%, so about a quarter of jobs in those 2 cities and regions reference flex, and that drives the ratio across the region more broadly, just because of the sheer volume of vacancies there. So that's just a very quick rattle through of the data. Now just going to give you some thoughts on what does that mean, why is it happening, and what can you do about it in terms of your role, where are the opportunities. So why is this happening? 3 thoughts. One is that whilst we've had huge change in the way we work, we've been in reactive mode historically. Now is the time to shift that into being far more proactive, to think about flexibility. You will all be starting to think about hybrid, but more broadly, we would ask you to think about the culture and behaviours that your organisations have, and the extent to which your business leaders and your organisations are leaning in and being proactive in owning the conversation about flex. The reason we don't have many jobs advertised as flex from hire is it links to why we expect employees to ask for flexibility, and then we'll consider, as I said, request response. Actually, we need to be flipping this to saying, if we want to be progressive, if we want to be on the front foot with talent, then as organisations, we need to own that conversation and be able to say, we are open to talking to you about hybrid working, we are open to talking to you about flexible working from day one, as well as for those employees that you have. Secondly, again, this comes back to culture and behaviours, and we know from CIPD's own research, last year highlighted that a lot of Scottish employers are still concerned about trust and performance and other issues in relation to people working from home. So whilst we have 3/4 of people looking to request, the research suggests that still only just over 1/3 of employers or managers are looking to grant this. There are reasons, there are cultural and behavioural reasons, but it's also complicated. And managers are going to need support, guidance, but also training in how to have those proactive conversations and how to think through some of the concerns around fairness and consistency and how to do this. And then the third call out is why we don't think this has shifted is, remember, hybrid is just one form of flexible working. So we've all worked remotely. We are all moving into hybrid, but the biggest chunk of flexible working in the jobs market is still part-time. And there has been hardly any shift in thinking or opportunities around part-time. If any, we have less part-time jobs in the labour market because the industries that predominantly employ part-time people, retail, hospitality, have been decimated. And there is a far wider implication here for the sheer volume of people we know in Scotland who are on furlough and who will be coming off of furlough onto redundancy, who need flex, who need part-time, and will be looking at a jobs market where only 1 in 4 jobs reference flexibility. Across the UK nationally last year, only 8% of jobs specifically reference part-time. So at a wider societal level, we have a major issue coming down the track. And we have a role and responsibility as employers to think about that. So what can we do? The very first thing to say is you as businesses have a huge opportunity to have a competitive edge on talent. You've worked out how to do part-time, flexible, hybrid. You're working that through. You've worked out how to let people work from home. You know now how many people want to retain that. You will also know that that represents a significant pool of people for whom flex from first is really, really important. So please don't, when you think about how you evolve your hybrid model, forget to think about the recruitment practice, the recruitment process, and also from an ED&I perspective, forget to think about how important actually flexible hiring can be for you to help you attract a very diverse talent pool as well. So say something, please, on your job vacancies and on your career pages. Please don't assume that people will ask. Even though we've been through this crisis, people are nervous still about the nature of the jobs market. And if they are looking to move, don't expect the candidate to ask, please promote it yourselves. But to do that, we have to address some of these underlying challenges, operationally and culturally, to being proactive about flex. There's a whole, and you'll have seen the CIPD, I hope, webinar on hybrid. We run a whole load of sessions ourselves at Timewise. I won't go into all of the detail, but I'll just call out a couple of things. So as part of your hybrid plans, challenge your business leaders to be thinking, are you making that shift from being reactive to proactive? Are you being planful? And have you got a clear vision? And are you thinking about the trust and the culture issues that need to sit underneath how you embrace hybrid working? If not, we talk about hybrid as a bit like Marmite at Timewise. You know, we have managers who love it and we have managers who hate it. Bring them together and facilitate those conversations if you can from an HR perspective. Secondly, you'll be hopefully putting a team on this. If you're a large organisation, think about hybrid in the context of a framework, and please make sure that that framework includes recruitment practices and you involve your resourcing teams in those conversations. And then next, and obviously really importantly, this won't just happen. We don't train managers in job design. We don't train managers in managing dispersed teams. We don't train managers in hybrid. We're starting to do so. It's really important for your managers to be able to do this well, for you as HR to try and give them some guidance and support. CIPD have a lot, but also think about what kind of further support they may need to try and work through hybrid. There are lots of issues with hybrid in the context of fairness and consistency, thinking about synchronous work and asynchronous work in teams. It's complex, but there is help available. I'm really happy to take questions. And then finally, in the context of inclusion, please don't forget part-time. It really matters. It matters to women in particular. It matters from a well-being perspective. If your organisation has got a great well-being strategy, one of the best things you can do to support people's well-being is to help them to work less if they want to. We've worked on average more hours than the rest of Europe through this pandemic, and we are continuing to do so. So helping people to work within the hours they're employed, but potentially to work less is a really good opportunity. I'm conscious of time. There are a number of organisations who do this very well in Scotland. I'm just going to call out 3 examples literally for a couple of minutes, just to show you the art of the possible. So a couple of firms we're working with. One is Optus, a global firm, 250 employees in Scotland, manufacturing. And they are being really thoughtful about fairness. because they recognise that hybrid is the future, but they recognise that not everybody can get the same flexibility. So they haven't got the answers yet, but they are looking at getting rid of their current flexi-time system because they don't think it drives the right behaviours. But they are also working with us to try and explore how they can offer some form of flexible working for every role, recognising it won't be the same. And I think that principle is really quite powerful. Another firm is Neptune Energy, offshore, Aberdeen. And again, cultural shift. They are really looking to fully embrace hybrid, but they have recognised that they have some real inconsistencies at a managerial and an exec level on how people think about flex. And so they are doing quite a lot to look at bringing their senior leaders together to facilitate conversations to try and challenge some of those stigmas. And then last, the Scottish Whisky Association, small firm, 40 staff, being really thoughtful about flex, have really already started to embrace hybrid, but critically are embracing flexible hiring. So are now very openly having those conversations, because as a small business, they know they want to have a competitive edge on talent. They may not be able to necessarily match major corporates in terms of other forms of remuneration, but what they can do is offer flex. So there's lots of examples. I'm really happy to take questions. I can see there's been quite a few coming in already, but I hope that's been helpful both in terms of giving you some data to take to your exec teams if you want to challenge them on flexible hiring, and also some examples of how you can think this through more thoughtfully. Back to you, Lee.
Thank you, Emma. Hugely insightful. So we have had some questions. So if it's okay with you, I'm going to just go right into those. So there's a couple of questions around the data itself. So maybe I can start with those. So, and I'm just going to read them out if that's all right. So some job adverts are including remote working as a temporary arrangement as a result of the pandemic, so not guaranteed to continue longer time. Do you include these jobs in your flexible working findings?
Yes, so so in our national index, we have done a bit more analysis on that. We include them in the one we're doing for Scotland. And what I will tell you is that when we've dug down into the data in a bit more detail, unfortunately, what we are seeing is approximately half of those who have cited options to work from home have specified during the pandemic. So that's a slightly worrying indication that they have been seeing this. And this, again, we're moving very fast, but as of last year, they were seeing this as a temporary thing to do. So, so again, we would urge you, if you are thinking about talking about remote working, obviously you need to align it to whether it's hybrid, but if you want to attract great people, that you are looking to maintain that and it is not necessarily temporary.
That would be quite an interesting one to track, wouldn't it? Because you do wonder whether it's just actually because we're in the midst still of so much uncertainty. Is that a deliberate move, or is it just actually a reflection of the times that we're in? And
I think if you're thinking about it from a candidate perspective, that's quite a difficult position to be in, because if you need to work flexibly and you are looking at jobs that now you could possibly do that aren't necessarily a very easy commute away, but you know that's only temporary, then you may not be applying for that job. And likewise, as an employer, we have an opportunity, and we know lots of firms are grappling with the idea about how far you reach in terms of geography to attract candidates. But we would urge you to think about talking about hybrid, definitely in recruitment adverts, as something which is more long term, because otherwise it's going to be very difficult. You're going to come up with some very difficult conversations if you hire somebody on the basis that they want to maintain this.
Okay, no, thank you for that. Another question for you, Emma. I'm going to get this. It's so easy for me, they're all for you. Have you made an assessment about how many jobs could have offered flexible working, so we can understand the gap between what's a realistic goal and how far that is from the current state and the best path to close the gap? It's a really good question.
So can you say that? Just say that. Say it one more time. That's quite complex.
No, no. Have you made an assessment about how many jobs could have offered flexible working? So I guess what are we aiming for? Yeah. Rather than stating where we are, what is the ambition? What's realistic for us to expect now?
So I think the ambition, I mean, we would say at Timewise that there should be flexibility in every role. I think there's a deeper piece here, which is that the ambition should be that you don't lose good candidates because they feel they have to bring up the conversation, that it's business as usual. And for it to be business as usual, we would urge that there's two things here. One is employers do this proactively and they believe in it. The other is a legislative route, which is they are forced to do it. We do support completely the view that we should be thinking about legislating. But I think we just got to be slightly careful that we also got to make sure that, you know, businesses want to do this and are supported to do this. So we would urge that the requirement to consider flex for every job should be there. The challenge comes when you think about different industries and different roles and what flex you're talking about. So yes, we would urge there is flex in every role, but it's not going to be the same. And that conversation relies on an organisation that has the right framework, the right support, the right management capabilities to enable people to work flexibly. So the goal is definitely, we think all jobs should be able to be open to flex and candidates should feel they can have that conversation openly. The work we need to do between now and then is to invest far more in supporting our managers to be able to know how to manage flexible teams, and we're not there yet, I don't think.
No, thank you for that. There is I'm just going to nip through some of the other questions that are around the survey, and then we can maybe move on to some of the practice related questions. I'm not sure I understand this, so I'm hoping you might, Emma. Do you have any data on the number of roles per category across Scotland?
Per category, I'm assuming you probably mean per role type, because it's, again, we make some assumptions around sector here, but we really can only, when we look at jobs boards, people don't advertise by sector, they advertise what the job is. So we have got background data on the volume, and obviously that has fluctuated. There are less jobs being advertised in Scotland last year than there were before. We're in a pandemic and people aren't hiring. But what we're really focusing on is the ratio, because it's the ratio of it. If we've got less jobs, have we got more of those jobs being flex than before? Because that's what matters to people who need flex. If you want to ask any more specific questions, though, please do get in touch, and we're happy to see how we can help in terms of actual numbers. Okay,
no, thank you, Emma. Jane's asking, 4-day working week, how far away is it? It's a quite a current topic in Scotland, particularly at the moment.
So we know the First Minister has proposed to look at that. So I think we're quite far away from it in terms of operational practice, if I'm honest. I think there are some amazing opportunities to think about in the context of the 4-day week. Again, at Timewise, we would just talk about that as being part-time working, but we have to be slightly careful when we unpick what we mean by the 4-day week. Are we talking about working full-time and compressed hours? Are we talking about being paid full-time and only working 4 days a week? Are we talking about offering other forms of flex? It's very complex. It's a great positioning statement, and we 100% support the idea of working this. But I think there are a lot of complex questions that sit underneath that. What happens if you work 3 days a week in an organisation as a part-timer in an organisation that's moving to a 4-day week? What does that mean for you in terms of fairness and consistency? Because are you going to get paid more for the hours that you work? What happens if you work in manufacturing or in construction and you need to be on site on a shift-based pattern, or you're a nurse? How does the 4-day week apply to you? So I think it's a great concept. I think we need to do a lot more testing, learning, thinking around what it really means and how we operationalise it.
Okay, no, thank you. You're right, there is a lot more unpicking. I think lots of people think of different things when they think of the 4-day week. Okay, no, thank you for everyone. Some really good questions coming in. So if we look at, bear with me, job share, from your stats, Emma, job share looks less popular, yet we know there are many benefits. What convincers are out there to influence?
So it's a really good question. Job share is less popular. It's operationally sometimes harder. You've got 3 people in the conversation, not 2. Where we have seen job share work incredibly well is in the civil service. They have a job share register. And what's interesting about the civil service is that they have enough volume, because the challenge with job share is the match. And what you will see, and in fact, we have some great examples of job share. We do an annual power list every year that champions very senior people working less. Going back to the point about the 4-day week and gender pay gap, it's the part-time piece that's the hardest here. And in our power list every year, we have a category for job sharers. So you'll see some fantastic examples, and please do go on our website and have a look, and you'll see how they make it work as well. But a lot of them have come from the civil service, because you can find matches, you can find people. So the hard thing with job share is, are you applying as a job share, or are you applying as an individual wanting somebody else? When you are applying as an individual, it's then the onus is very difficult for the employer, clearly, because they have to match you with somebody. The most successful job shares are those where people have come together and they've moved together. And that works incredibly well. Or in an organisation like the civil service, where you have enough volume to match people. So, so we think job share is fantastic in certain roles that can't, where flex on time can't happen, but where people who need to work part-time can apply. We also think that businesses need to recognise, in the main, and all the evidence shows, the most effective job shares may cost you more because you will need some overlap. But what you often get is 2 brains, two sets of skills, and very delineated work. So, so I would call out looking at civil service. I would call out looking at our website for some examples in other industries. Aviva have a great male job share, which we've put a case study on, and that's really good to look at. But it is slightly more complex, and that is why it's harder. There are some platforms and some firms that specialise in job share matching. And there's some great technology, but again, it goes back to, is your organisation conceptually, culturally open to this? I urge you to ask that question before you think about those platforms.
No, thank you, Emma. We had a great case study at the conference, the Scottish conference, a couple of weeks ago. We did 2 ladies from the BBC, Rachel and Wendy, did a great, the HR directors for the BBC, and they gave a great examples of their experience, but also what's happening culturally in the BBC. So that's another organisation that I would signpost. So moving on to, there's a question around working hours. So there's lots of opportunities to improve the status quo. The stat that we were and still are the working the longest hours in Europe. What's the reference for that, Emma?
So it was an OECD report that came out a few months ago, and I think it was something like, on average, we're working between 8 to 10 hour days. And so we always were ahead of Europe in terms of working hours. We peaked, everyone went up last year. We went up a bit more. Most European countries are starting to come down, we're not. But if you, we can dig out the link and share it when we share the slides. But yeah, it's worrying. And I know CIPD have done analysis on this as well, but what we've certainly seen from businesses we're working with is a really concerning tail off around productivity. So the holy grail is that flexible working enhances productivity, and there's lots of anecdotal feedback to suggest that. but it doesn't make it worse. So there isn't a cost for flexibility in the long term. Last year, all the early stage analysis showed that actually productivity was maintained or improved. In the last 6 months, we're starting to see that dip, certainly with the firms that we're working with, just because people's resilience, and there is burnout, and these over hours are detrimental. So I think it's really important when we think about that kind of analysis around sort of hours, productivity, flexibility, to be really clear on the hours point, and hours and how much time is worked really matters in terms of how you get the best out of people, as well as when they work and the location piece. And that's why we urge, when you think about your hybrid strategies, to not forget. At minimum, well-being is about helping people to work within the hours they're employed, and not feel that they have to be responding to emails at midnight or wherever. At best, it's about embracing shorter working hours as an opportunity for people who need to.
Okay, no, thank you for that. Now, one of the things I usually say when we're asking people to put questions is sometimes we don't know all the answers. So Michael is asking, interesting, why Dumfries and Galloway so low compared to Argyll and Bute? Are there similar remote populations and industries, Emma? I have to say, Michael, I have no idea. So I don't know if you can share, but Michael, there's maybe something that we can look into together after this to do a little, unless Emma, you can shed some light on that.
Michael, I'd love for this. I can tell you precisely why. I'm afraid I can't either.
No.
We mapped the regions. We made some assumptions in the report as to why this is the case. I think, however, it's a really interesting conversation to have with the local authorities there. And we certainly are, we're continuing to do our programme of work with Scottish Government, and one of the things we want to look at is the place-based approach to flexibility, and to what extent actors in places and what we call kind of anchor institutions can influence this. So if you have a particular locality where there are less flexible jobs, really trying to unpick that in a bit more detail. So I would imagine the local authorities, should be interested in this, and B, I would hope might have a view on it. But notwithstanding that, as businesses, it is harder when we have less people and more remote and rural populations to process how we think about flexibility. Clearly, remote working is a massive opportunity. And we would urge that firms are going to continue to embrace that. But we also recognise that if you put sectoral and regional issues together, you may be a small manufacturing firm in a rural region, or probably farming. It's going to be much harder. Just recently, we started doing some work with the veterinary industry, who struggle to retain women. Hours are crazy. But there are ways you can get through that again. There are ways you can get through that. But I think that's about really trying to understand at a deeper level the nature of the work and what parts of the work can be done at home and what parts are going to be required to be elsewhere. And that's probably a great opportunity for thinking about job shares as well.
Okay, no, thank you for that. And that leads us quite nicely on to a question that Radhika asked very early on in the discussion. So if we can move to maybe some of the practice based questions now. So how can we convince business leaders to offer flex from day one, especially for apprentices or graduates? Now, at this point, it would be remiss of me not to flag up that there is quite a lot of support and guidance on this on the CIPD website about how to build the business case for flex working. So I would very much point people to that. So it just talks around a talent attraction, improved engagement, all the benefits around it that I think are good to highlight to those leaders. And I know that you've talked a lot about training and the ideas and supporting line managers, and you've talked about trust and performance and things, Emma, but I don't know if you've got anything particular to add around apprentices or graduates.
So with young people, so a few things. I mean, just sort of rehearsing those kind of conversations with your senior leaders. I think it's about objection handling and challenge back to them. So most business leaders want fresh young talent. The evidence, and we've got it in our research, shows that 9 out of 10 millennials want flex. It's it's the group that wants it the most. So if you want to attract young talent, one of the best things you can do is to offer flexibility. The second thing I would say is, okay, so you've got a concern, and historically it's been a big concern with business leaders, that how can you offer flexibility to someone you've never met? It's fine if you're an employee and you've kind of earned your stripes and you've been there for 6 months and then you earn the right to request. I mean, we challenge that right because it should just be a given. But if we've been through a pandemic, these are young people that maybe they're new to work, but they've seen everybody working flexibly. Maybe if they're in their second job, they've worked flexibly. So I think you just need to challenge the sort of trust piece, which is we're all doing this now. And if we're good at flex and trusting our current employees and we can't see them and we have the right framework in place, then why can't we onboard a graduate with that way of working? Now, having said that, I think it's also important to recognise that onboarding somebody into an organisation in a pandemic is difficult. In a remote landscape, it is difficult. But that's not the reason to say no. The solution is to look at your onboarding processes and how to do those effectively and remotely. Think about buddies, think about better communication. So there are ways around it. But if the concern is about trust, I think you have to call that out. You have to call out the opportunity for the individual. And on apprenticeships, we've done a project at Timewise on part-time apprenticeships. I would argue that it's a great way to think about diversity. That there are very few women in certain industries that apply for apprenticeships because they can't learn full-time in the same way they can't work full-time. It is possible to offer part-time apprenticeships, just the government guidance is slightly fuzzy, I think is probably the term I would use. So that's a great way to bring somebody new into your organisation as an apprenticeship in a way that is a bit more gentle for them and for you. But we've got a report on our site. I'm really happy to point you to that or to have a look at some of the work we've done around apprenticeships as well.
Also, just to further that, and the findings and recommendations haven't been made yet, but I sit on the Scottish Apprenticeship Advisory Board employer group, and we are actually doing a piece of work around gender at the moment, and it's about it's not just about females into different sectors, it's about males into the care sector. You know that it works both ways. Yeah. But we are going to be presenting our recommendations and findings quite soon on that. So that is something that is very much front of mind for us as CIPD in Scotland because we're involved in the discussion. That's a really good question. So thank you for your answer on that, Emma, and we can share the work that you've done. It'd actually be very useful for me in the work that we're doing with the Scottish Apprenticeship Advisory Board too. So, and then we've got time, just got a few more minutes. So we've got one question, which is quite a long question, so bear with me while I read it out, Emma. So do you have any suggestions as to how you ensure fairness when offering flexibility in all jobs whilst accommodating certain job requirements? For example, in my organisation, we have some jobs that could be fully flex, time and place, but others that can flex pace but not time, and some that can do neither. So it's that whole fairness discussion. In the past, we've experienced flexibility left to teams results in big differences in what's offered and taken up. So how do we have a more standardised approach that is fair?
So I think the first thing to do is to just acknowledge that you can't offer the same flexibility for every role, and it's okay to do that. And the more your managers are open and honest about that, I think the better the culture and the expectation will be. It's really important to distinguish between a fair and consistent process and a fair and consistent outcome. So I think I would advocate that you explore within your organisation or facilitate your managers to explore how can you come up with a position and a set of principles that are fair, which is, and we've just done the work we've just done with BAM Construct, big construction firms, really interesting. They've come up with a vision statement, which is for this precise reason, you know, guys or women who are loading bricks on site or down holes are not the same as engineers who are able to work from home. So their positioning statement is, we embrace flexibility and we will offer it, but it won't be the same in every role. So it's just about, I think, starting from that standpoint, and then it's about exploring what kind of flex you can offer and recognising the three axes around whether it is how much, whether it is where, or whether it is when. And in interdependent roles, particularly frontline roles, it's probably the when. It might be staggered start and finish times. It might be also other things you can think about in terms of advance notice on shifts, input into scheduling. Again, we've got a model we use for our innovation unit, which is a different axes to the how much, when and where, which is what we call shift life balance. Have to be careful how you say that, but it's about how much input, notice and predictability you get. So there are tools out there, CIPD have them as well, but it's about recognising a fair and consistent approach, not shying away, being transparent, and then trying to explore. The other axis clearly is then individuals and what they want, but being honest is the best route, having those proactive conversations and saying, we'll explore this, the answer may be no. I would advocate for.
Okay, no, thank you. There's one question that we'd still not answered, and I'd really like to go to that. So it is kind of connecting in on the discussion before around line managers and business leaders, but actually also asking about recruitment teams. So do recruitment teams need to be more proactive? So is there more proactive in offering flexible working options to potential candidates while advertising vacancies? So is there anything in particular that you would like to highlight that recruiters can be doing more of, Emma?
Yes, so thank you for the question. Going back to the hiring point. So what we see a lot is organisations going out to recruiters, so to recruitment agencies, saying we want a diverse shortlist. What we urge recruitment agencies to respond with is, are you advertising your job flexibly? If you are, you'll get one. So as a recruiter, as a resourcing lead or an in-house recruiter, just to consider and trial referencing flexible working on job ads. I mean, that's the starting point, and see what happens. Persuade your hiring manager to try it. The Behavioural Insights team big study that happened recently showed you will get higher and more quality candidates. If you do that, you will get more women. And then it's about embedding that into the recruitment process. And the absolute critical thing to say on that point is, if your resources and your recruiters are saying it, make sure that you have those conversations with your hiring managers, so that when the candidate rocks up at the interview and they say, great, can I explore X, Y, or Z? The hiring manager has been briefed and is open to it, because otherwise you'll end up with a very poor candidate experience. So it's about trying it, embedding it through the process, making sure it's written in the questions for the hiring manager. Make sure they ask, what kind of flexibility are you looking for? Let's have a conversation about what we might or might not be able to accommodate, so that it doesn't just fall off the radar. Mm-hmm. Again, we've got lots and lots of guidance, both on Timewise and also on Timewise Jobs, our job site, if it's helpful, both for employers and for job seekers as well.
Okay, no, thank you for that, Emma. And it is just about having that conversation at the earliest point, isn't it? Both with the line manager, but also during the recruitment process. And I say that's someone that's recently hired. So having that kind of open conversation right from the earliest point is just so important. So listen, we're out of time, we're a wee bit over. So thank you very much, Emma, for sharing some really interesting findings and great context to flexible working in Scotland. There's so much insight available from this index, and something for each of us to reflect on and think about in the context of our own organisation, our own teams, our own processes and policies, and about the change that we think we can make in our own organisation or organisations that we work with if we are independent practitioners in the networks we're part of. So thank you, that was a great discussion, and I'm sure there's lots more that we can be continuing to work with you and everyone that's dialing into the discussion over the longer term. I'd just like to draw attention again to the CIPD resources that are available to you, as well as the resources that Emma's mentioned. Timewise have some great resources. And also organisations like Flexibility Works that we work very closely with and are championing the cause in Scotland. So I do encourage you to look at all of our resources. And as you can see, there's still a lot of work that we could be doing, a lot of opportunities, a lot of work that we could be doing in Scotland for those that are seeking flexible and part-time working, so making it a lot more of a level playing field. But anyway, we're out of time. So thank you again for listening. Thank you, Emma, for taking the time to join us today. Thank you.
Pleasure. Thank you very much. Bye.